Everybody. I'm Beth Osborne. I am the Director of Transportation for America, and hopefully people can hear me. We are having a little bit of a challenge with our technology, as is so often the case. So hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. I am going to attempt to give folks a little bit of understanding of all the activity since the Trump administration took office. I want to make clear that it is not completely clear to us or them, but we will let you know what we know so far, and then we'll talk a little bit about the opportunities in reauthorization. So I am going to share my screen, and hopefully everyone can see my presentation now. All right. So we are going to start with a conversation about the executive orders that emanated from the White House and from the U.S. Department of Transportation since inauguration, and try to make a little bit of sense of that. And there'll be opportunities for people to put questions in the Q&A and in the chat, so that we can answer a little bit of that, and then we'll jump into a conversation about longer term opportunities in reauthorization. So on January 20th, President Trump signed several executive orders, including one called Unleashing American Energy, which seemed to stop all spending under what's known as the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, the IIJA, which funds most of the transportation program. The next day, the Office of Management and Budget, which is a very powerful entity within the White House, tried to clarify that they only meant to stop the funds under the IIJA that and within the IIJA that ran afoul of areas, priorities that the Trump administration didn't like DEI, climate, and other hot button issues for them. I'm going to let folks know I'm very happy to share these slides. I know I should just say that up front, but even when I say up front that the slides will be shared, I will get 25 questions about where the slides, whether or not the slides will be shared. So when the next question pops up, if folks wouldn't mind just sharing yes, that'd be great. Yes, I'm happy to always share my slides. On the 27th, OMB kind of reversed course and paused all federal disbursements, not just the ones under the IIJA or the IRA. And they sent out this wild PDF spreadsheet to all the agencies in 2-point type that was supposed to set up a grading system of all existing federal programs to determine whether or not those programs should be allowed to go forward, or whether or not they were, inappropriate woke ideology. On the 29th, OMB ended the funding freeze and said that evaluation of projects would go forward, and that on the 18th of February, they would announce which programs were going to be frozen for running afoul of the issues that the Trump administration didn't like. On the 31st, a judge issued a temporary restraining order saying that the Trump administration could not freeze funds, but they continued to freeze funds. So that continued. So on February 18th, the deadline for the elimination of the Department of Transportation funding, that was, again, out of line with the priorities the Trump administration laid out, didn't happen. And it turns out they discovered that going line by line on every program and every single grant was a bit more of an undertaking than they had originally anticipated. So they are still going through that process now. And instead, on the 18th, the Trump administration, the White House, released a memorandum called Radical Transparency about wasteful spending, and made clear to the agencies that they should go as far as the law will allow about being clear to the public about what grants are frozen and which ones aren't. I will say that there has not been transparency, much less radical transparency, but we've always been in favor of getting more information on how money is being spent. So we're certainly in favor of that transparency. And on the 28th, there's a deadline for a report from the Office of General Counsel on the status of implementation of all of these executive orders. Before I throw things open to questions, I want to add that there's been an announcement that has been relatively confusing about a new layer of reviews of the Metropolitan Planning Organization's transportation improvement programs. Those are called TIPs. And it has generally, what we require on the TIP is required of the State Transportation Improvement Program, the STIP. However, what we are hearing is, while FHWA will insist on reviewing every amendment to a TIP, they will not be doing the same for the State Transportation Improvement Program, the STIP. So there is still a lot of confusion around what that means. It seems that they want to seek whether or not those amendments violate their executive orders, but in reality, what it will do is create delay to work at the regional level, and states will be allowed to make amendments whether it is good for the executive orders or in line with the executive orders or not. So that is where we are. Before I jump into reauthorization, I do want to make time for any outstanding questions. I also do want to there is a question right now about, and go ahead and enter any questions you have in the Q&A. It's just going to be a little bit easier because we have about 700 people on this, so it's going to be hard to do by hand raise. So one person asked if I could speak further about the memo pushing for greater funding to states with higher birth rates. That is a USDOT memo from the secretary saying that they're going to evaluate spending based on a bunch of issues. One thing is a user pay approach. They're apparently pro user pay, except if it's congestion pricing. I think they were a little inexact. They meant to say that they don't want transit to be funded. I think the notion that there's no user pay, even though most places have fares, so users are paying, and they may not be paying the whole cost, but neither is the driver, because the gas tax isn't covering anywhere near the whole highway program. Then they have issues like birth rates, places with above average birth rates, places with above average marriage rates. They mention mask mandates and vaccine mandates. This is very confusing. A lot of the places that have high birth rates are certainly red states, but they are not always. I mean, Florida, which is pretty red state, does not have an above average birth rate. West Virginia has one of the lowest. In terms of marriage rates tend to be higher in more urbanized areas. So I don't know that they've really thought through the implication there. DC, in fact, has some of the highest marriage rates and lowest divorce rates, but it seems like they're throwing things out there and they're not quite sure what they mean yet. They also, like I said, are addressing vaccine mandates and mask mandates, which is a little confusing because every single state has a vaccine mandate and they didn't specify which ones and in what cases. And in terms of mask mandates, no states have it. So they have a lot of things that they put in their their order, but what it means is almost impossible to figure out. There's a question about whether the TIP amendment review will also apply to rural, to RTPOs, so the rural version of MPOs. And I think that's going to be left up to your state. It depends on the way the state and your state division of federal highways interprets it. The answer to almost all of these questions, unfortunately, is it entirely depends upon what the people in your state office for the Federal Highway Administration determines the orders mean. So they're wildly different. In some places, they will interpret that rural tips are included, and some they won't. In some places, SS4A is being affected, in some places they're not. In some places, you know, it might, they might be doing quick reimbursements for certain programs and working on grant agreements. In some states, they're not. So yes, you really need to be ready to ask questions of your Federal Highways Office, and certainly your congressional delegation. They should be helping you get answers to these questions, and the only way you're going to find out is to push the issue. So I strongly encourage you to be in touch and ask those questions. And if you don't get those questions answered from your state or your federal, your FHWA state office, you need to be on the phone with your congressional delegation. And you also need to be on the phone with your state legislators and your DOT and make clear that you're looking for them to backstop what the feds pull out of. In terms of STIP amendments, what's affected? I don't know. It's going to be wildly different from state to state. The way STIP amendments and TIP amendments are handled are different state to state, and how that's going to be interpreted, because what's coming out of the White House and the Secretary's office is not your typical thought through approach where there's also opportunity for change and comment. It's just not the way it's happening. So you need to ask those questions. You need to push for those answers. And all we know is that Federal Highways is going to do some level of review of TIPs, but it seems right now that they will not do that review of STIPs. So if your question is, will my project be affected? There's only one way to answer that question, and that is to get on the phone to everyone you can and get them to answer that question. I don't know. It is utterly inconsistent and confusing. So that's going to be real fun. You know, Deborah points out that they said not evaluate, but give preference to. But so what if you have a high birth rate, but you have a vaccine mandate? Or they said you sanctuary cities. A lot of sanctuary cities have high birth rates. This is my point. They have not thought through how you apply this. When you apply several criteria to a decision, you have to have a system that goes along with that. They don't. That's why if you're asking, will my project be impacted? The only way to answer that question is to get on the phone with your DOT, with your Federal Highways Division office, and with your congressional delegation, and get those answers. I do hope that you all will be in touch with us to explain more about what you're seeing the impact to be. The more you can send those stories to us, the more we can share them and put them together. So please do, as you see these things, share them. And at this point, I think I'm going to go ahead and jump into the overall conversation about reauthorization and where our opportunities lie there. Martha asks, I will just answer this question. Do they really have a system, or can they just direct money to any project they like? I don't know. They're doing things that shouldn't be allowed, and they're moving forward. We are in a brave new world, and what they should or shouldn't do is not the same as what they can and can't do. So we're gonna learn a lot here. All right, let's jump back into the presentation if I can find it. All right. Here we go. Okay, transportation reauthorization 101, and we'll have more time for Q&A, I promise. I just wanted to review the process with folks, and we do have a report on our website as well. And Elisa, if you wouldn't mind grabbing that link and putting it in the chat, that would be great, or Rachel, whomever has ready access to it. Transportation reauthorization happens every 5 to 7 years usually, and that's just enough time for everyone to forget how it works. And that is a feature, not a bug. It makes sure that there's not really an opportunity to learn from the last battle and put that into effect in the next battle. So quick historical timeline. Our federal highway program was created in 1956. There's some notable things that occurred along the way. Transit became part of the trust fund in 1982 as part of a deal to raise the gas tax. There was an effort to raise the gas tax by 5 cents, and a lot of urban representatives said, we're not going to get as much money through the highway side because we're already built out. So we want one of those 5 new pennies per gallon to go to transit. And that's when the 80-20 split was born. And that's the last time that urban representatives really asked for anything. The regime we have in place now was really set up in 1991 under a law called ICE-T. Don't worry about what these things stand for. You can look them up if you want, but it doesn't really matter. In 1993 was the last time the federal gas tax was increased, and it was part of a budget deal, not a reauthorization. In 98, under T21, which was a regular reauthorization, they took power out of the hands of appropriators so that the trust fund was complete and funding would be set by the authorizers through this reauthorization process without having to go through the annual spending process. There was a bill in 2005 called Safety Lou, not terribly notable, but in 2008, under the way they built Safety Lou funding, that was the last year the trust fund fully covered the federal surface transportation program. 2009, we had to start making up funds, and that has been the case to today. The notion that there are donors and donees hasn't existed since 2009. There was a bill in 2012 that set up a performance management process that has not had much of an impact on the program. And then the FAST Act in 2015. And of course, folks are familiar with the IIJA, also known as the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, which is what will be expiring at the end of September 30th, 2026. Quick review of what was in that. Transportation made up a little more than half of the overall IIJA. The big change to the pie chart was the rail program, which has not spent much of that funding at all. But highways continues to make up the majority, and there's still an 80-20 split between highways and transit. Within the highway program, you will notice that the overwhelming majority, about 75%, go to 2 programs. These are the Surface Transportation Block Grant, which is super flexible, can be used for anything you can imagine in surface transportation. The National Highway Performance Program is really for all kinds of different projects that support the interstates and the national highway system. A lot of the things people get excited about can be found in that other slice of the pie. But you might sense from this that if you're spending 2% on carbon reduction and 75% of it, and even some of the safety stuff is not focused on carbon reduction, you're not really making a huge amount of progress. And sometimes people point to competitive grants, and I just want to make clear that we're talking about $1 or $4 billion for each of those. But if you look at the overall highway program, you're talking about a program that is 55, and by the end of it will be over $60 billion. So not at the expiration of this program of the IIJA, but a little over a year into it, we are going to hit a massive funding crash. And that's because the deficit spending will have ended. The whether you call it forward appropriations or whatever, the point is the deficit spending will be over and the trust fund will be expended, because we're only raising about $44 billion in gas taxes 2028, but we are spending significantly more. There will be a desire to knock out any of the non-highway program. I think there will be plenty of folks saying, if we just get rid of passenger rail, which frankly, they didn't spend any of their money anyway, and transit and the competitive grants and research, then we'll be closer. But as you can see here, the highway program will still be well above what the gas taxes are bringing in. And even if you cut out the quarter of the pot that is for, we will say, for things like safety and carbon reduction and issues like that, you still don't make up the difference. So from a political strategic point, it's not a great idea to first take your whole coalition and throw them out of the tent and then need help making up a funding gap. But I think there will be a bunch of people that try to do just that. So I see people raising their hands. I just want to remind folks, we have 600, 700 people on this call, so I will not be able to call on people to speak. But if you want to put what your questions into the chat, or more effectively, the Q&A where I am monitoring, I will do my best to get to it. And I have staff that will be looking at it and trying to answer by text if I can't get to it. So the way the House and the Senate are set up are very different. The House committee jurisdiction is divided between 3 committees, but really it's 2. House Transportation and Infrastructure has most of the program. The Science, Space, and Technology program just has research, but the funding is handled by Ways and Means. So most of the conversation is between Transportation and Infrastructure. If there were enough funding through the gas tax, they wouldn't need anybody else's help. But because the program's going to run a shortfall, they'll need the help of Ways and Means to come up with more money. My slide about the Senate, I apologize for this, is missing. The Senate is even more complicated. Jurisdiction is divided between 4 committees. The Finance Committee handles the funding when more funding is needed. But there are 3 committees that handle the jurisdiction of the substance. So Environment and Public Works handles highways mostly and highway planning. The Banking and Urban Affairs Committee handles transit and transit planning. And then all the other things like safety and trucking and pipelines and stuff like that is in the Commerce Committee. So a lot of people want to know how this process goes, and I'm just going to run through the ideal timeline here. I want to point out that there is nothing that will require them to follow this timeline, and things often fall behind. But this is what it would take to get a reauthorization passed before the current bill expires on September 30th, 2026. So they're already starting to hold hearings. The Environment Public Works will hold a hearing tomorrow on what is and isn't working. Then in the House Transportation Infrastructure Committee is starting to hold meetings with stakeholders. So that's going to keep going to gather information about what people like, what people don't like, get various stakeholders' positions on what changes they'd like to see to the program, things like that. Then in the fall, again, ideally, the White House would issue their own reauthorization proposal. That's going to be super duper hard for a new administration. I was in the Obama administration and we weren't fully staffed up until the end of our first year. So putting together a reauthorization and getting it cleared through other agencies would be really hard, but even harder for this White House, which is cutting staff who would be doing that reviewing. Almost every administration since the Nixon administration has put out their own reauthorization proposal, except for the Obama administration before MAP 21 in 2012. And I can get into why that is offline, but it was for foolish and ridiculous reasons. You would then hope to see bills introduced in early 2026. The House would be led by transportation infrastructure. The Senate is traditionally led by environment public works, but there's no reason why they should be. It's just a sense that highways are the important part. So we'll wait for the highway committee. I don't understand why banking and commerce allow that to happen, but they generally do. Then hearings would be held on the bills, and then they would be passed through committee, and all the titles from all the committees would be put together and sent to the House and Senate floor for passage. You'd want that to be done in the summer so that the two sides of Capitol Hill could go through a conference committee and work out any differences between their bills and negotiate with the White House. With a deal reached, both chambers would pass their agreed to compromise, and it would be signed by the president. Having said all of that, we've never made a deadline ever. So I don't expect that we are going to make our deadline this time. I think we should expect at least I would expect at least a year extension. No one wants to come up with a ton of extra money or cut programs right before a congressional election. So I would expect a 6-month to 1-year extension. And we frankly spent many years in extensions, so that could go on for a while, especially facing a major budget shortfall. And then I just want to point out, EPW is going to ask, what do we get for our current expenditures? And I would argue we are not getting good results at all. We, the United States, are we have some of the least safe roads in the developed world. You can see we're way over to the right on this graph. This is a look at 70 countries that participate in a roadway safety coalition. And you can see that our roads per 100,000 inhabitants are more unsafe than Argentina, Serbia, and Chile. They're several times less safe than Hungary and Greece. And I mean, just way off the charts as you go to the left. These other countries are actually making progress. They're not just making progress in terms of preventing fatalities and serious injuries on their roadways for people inside cars, but they're making incredible improvements for people outside of their cars. And while a few countries will have a year or so where they'll see an increase, it's a small increase on a low baseline, and we are seeing still increases on a large baseline. And we're celebrating tiny improvements off of terrible numbers, even just after 1 year of tiny improvements. So after spending what turns out to be $1.5 trillion since ICE-T was passed in 1991, we are so embarrassing that in the report that this is pulled from, they actually calculate the progress without the United States, because without the United States in it, all of these countries are making progress. We're getting crumbling roads and bridges, and I pulled this out of a report that we did called Repair Priorities. But if you just pull up the conditions and performance report from the U.S. Department of Transportation, they will show you that pretty steadily less than 50% of our roads are in good condition. That number is not really improving. The number of percentage of roads in poor condition has been ticking up. We have seen some improvements on bridges, so that's good, but it's minor, and it's certainly way lower than you would expect for historic investment. And a lot of that is simply because it's more fun to build more. as opposed to take care of existing. So you see how much is going to expansion while we're not making a ton of progress on the condition of our roads and bridges. We've gotten significantly more emissions. We did a report called Fueling the Crisis that you can also find online, and the states in red are the ones whose expenditures under the bipartisan infrastructure law will result in an increase in carbon emissions. The ones that are more green are the ones whose investments will lead to a decrease in funding. I also fear that a bunch of our assumptions were very generous and inappropriately so. So I think most states are doing worse than we show here, but unfortunately, you can see that on a bipartisan basis, states are doing poorly, and on a bipartisan basis, some smaller subset is doing okay. So a lot of that is because, again, money is being spent on, building a lot of new roads and expanding roads. And so these little lumps in blue show that some of our programs are bringing down emissions, but it's just not enough to keep up with the things we're doing that will add emissions. And we've also gotten more traffic. We studied traffic from 1993 to 2017, and we found that in the largest 100 cities in the country, that every single one of them saw a major increase in congestion. At the front end, you have Brownsville, Texas, that saw a 73% increase in their population, might be 75, over a 300% increase in their lane miles, and a 1,200% increase in congestion. If you look at on the other side, Detroit had a 5% decrease in population, a 15% increase in highway lane miles, and a 45% increase in congestion. So everything we're doing is working very poorly in the number one goal that we see at in DOTs, which is to reduce congestion. It just is not. I'm going to finish up by this is my 6th reauthorization, and I think it's really important for folks to understand what we do that doesn't work. The folks in the status quo like to say, when we ask for something different, that you can already do that thing we want done. We tend to find when you dig in that if they say we're already doing this, they're not really. Or maybe they're doing it sometimes, but they're not doing it regularly. They ask for an added eligibility, but they ignore added eligibilities. They add a planning factor because it doesn't actually impact their decisions. They say, oh, that's a good reform, make transit do it, just not the highway program. And how about we create a small program, even better if it's not in the trust fund, to fix the thing that the big program is doing to harm things. And at this point, I just want to go back to this. So look at the carbon reduction program. How about we carve out 2% to fix what the rest of the program is harming? How about we carve out 6% to fix safety while the rest of the program can harm safety? You might point out transportation alternatives also is good for safety. Okay, 9% to fix what much of the rest of the program can be harming. And that is why we don't see big changes in terms of the outcomes. And again, I want to point out why the status quo is so resilient. The attitude that passing a bill must happen and that we will do anything to sustain my program, even if my program is a little part of the pie, we are willing to see the damage of the whole thing to sustain our little bitty piece. That's very powerful to make sure the program doesn't change. We like to point to a few good projects, but ignore and not eliminate the bad things happening. So we have an important program that is helping to support complete streets, but the overall program is creating incomplete streets that are incredibly dangerous. We look at that one complete street in the community that's great, and we ignore all the other ones. We make it about money, not policy. We will figure out how to fill the funding gap because we're so afraid our programs will be on the chopping block. And by the time the funding is fixed, they're done with policy changes. So if you don't get those commitments before you fix the funding, you're not going to get it. We accept speeches and platitudes without real change. I think that's what we saw with the last administration. We get plans and lists of best practices. We get streamlining for highways and not transit. The standards, tools, and processes stay the same, so it's hard to build a complete street, even if there's money for it. And our programs, whether competitive or formula, are funding both cool new things and some status quo projects. So my program, which was originally known as Tiger, that I managed the first 5 rounds of, was funding some really exciting things, but it also was funding some not good things. And making that trade, even in the little bits of programs you love, it creates real problems. I'll just finish by saying the Highway Safety Improvement Program funds some projects that really makes safety not good. They love to do slip lanes and things like that that are at real risk to people walking and biking. So our opportunities are and challenges. On Capitol Hill, few Hill staffers or even members of Congress understand this program. It doesn't come up often enough for them to learn it. On Capitol Hill now, you probably have about 15 staffers between both the House and the Senate who was there during the IIJA. So everybody else is new. And if you go talk to them now, they're likely to leave their position before we get to the next reauthorization. So we have to stay in close and constant contact through those staff changes so that that staffer that only works on transportation when it comes up, which it probably won't come up during their tenure, they have somebody to go to, and it's you. 2, the best funded organizations make money off the status quo. So asking them to change things is going to be kind of out of pocket. We can point that out. We can point out that we have grassroots support for change. And with most every elected official, grassroots people locally are more important than national groups, even us. And we will hear there's not enough funding for the trust fund. Congress and the administration is going to have to cover that gap. There's going to be a gap no matter how many people they try to throw overboard. Those that don't provide them cover, those that will not support more funding for this program without massive changes will have the most leverage. I can tell you when I worked on Capitol Hill, those who were willing to let the program fall got basically everything they wanted. That was a very small subset. And those that said, we agree, something has to happen, I'll take. I will default to this before I will allow the program to fall, get very little or nothing. So that was a lot. And I know we have a ton of questions here, and I will run through a bunch of them. And we might also look to pick through some of these and put up a blog post with the answers that we couldn't get to today. I am sorry that we can't get to everything, but let's see. Let's go to the reauthorization questions, and we'll be happy to save the webinar chat. There are some great points. I've been watching them go past us, and the conversation there is amazing. So thank you all. Keep adding your thoughts there. There's a question here that raise has been changed to build, and protect has been pulled until further notice. How do I foresee other programs going forward, particularly tribal assistance? I have no idea. I don't know. They don't know. Nobody knows. I think they're going to review these programs one by one, and we're going to get kind of scattershot announcements as things go forward. And these are questions that you should be asking your congressional delegation. And frankly, they are hearing a ton from folks worried about Medicaid cuts, but they really aren't hearing much on transportation. And I've heard, particularly from Republican congressional offices, that the fact that they haven't heard a lot on that tells them that's a safer place to cut and allow cuts to happen than in the places they are hearing from folks. So keep that in mind. There, Abby asks if the reauthorization bill isn't passed by September 30th and they do have extensions, does that mean they typically level fund the highway programs? It means they level fund everything. Everything just continues so long as there is funding to support them. So yeah, that's exactly right. Everything just continues at that level for as long as the extension exists. Now, the trick is when those extensions are short. And if you go to our reauthorization 101 report, you'll find that we have had times where you get a year extension, but then we have some that are a couple of days or a few weeks or a month. And that's when it gets really confusing, because what is a week of a 5-year program? We'll have to see how that goes. I do expect a year-long extension. It's possible they'll try to put pressure on themselves by doing just 6 months, but they'll have to extend that. Could funding delays stave off road development, widening new freeways? Heck, yeah, it could. And this is my point. This is my 6th reauthorization, and we have felt like if we simply protect our programs, then we're doing good. But I think we have to look morally at the damage that much bigger programs are doing and determine if the damage if we are comfortable from a moral perspective in getting a little good for a lot of bad. And that's just a question for all of us. I can tell you my opinion is no, that's not acceptable. And I would rather, have a short-term crisis in this program and force everyone to talk about how to modernize it than continue to eat forward with little tiny changes to a program that has provided us with terrible results, the ones I went through in this presentation. There is a question about the FY25 budget negotiations that are underway, and Betsy says it feels like the funding freeze, Trump administration violation of the TRO is proof that we won't abide by any of the funding commitments anyway. Yes, I am worried about that. I am further worried about the fact that I think the Trump administration has a very good case to make in the courts about whether or not they have to follow appropriations. I think that their argument that the power of the purse is to say up to how much can be spent, and it doesn't mean every dime has to be spent, is borne out by the entire history of every year in every agency. I can tell you when I was at USDOT that there were times that we were panicked at the end of the year because we had not spent any or most of some funding that we had gotten, and we knew that would put us on the line for cuts. You didn't use it last year, so you clearly don't use it this year. But that means there's a long history of not spending everything that Congress has appropriated. And if that's the case, then it can't be illegal. Then that can't always, we've never called that impoundment before. There's no sense that would be illegal. So what's the difference between underspending it by 20% and underspending it by 100%? And that's going to be a pretty comfortable position, I think, for the court. So yes, I am deeply concerned about that, and think people on Capitol Hill need to consider what appropriations needs to look at going forward in order to use what would be left of the power of the purse to, dictate what the administration should and shouldn't do. Let's see. The last bill was negotiated under Democratic control of all 3 branches. This one, unless delayed, will be under full Republican control. How different will it be? Look, I consider the last bill to be terrible. I really, as pointed out by our Fueling the Crisis report, we are going to be increasing carbon and public health harming emissions by huge amounts. We are doing everything that we say we don't want done in the name of little tiny programs to do better things, or a big rail program that just didn't get out the door because for every decision you had 50 people that had to look at it. The last administration was very much in love with process. How will it be different? The difference between Republican and Democratic administrations in the past have been minimal. Safety Lou was passed under, I think it was under a trifecta, Republican, White House, House, Senate. MAP 21, IIJA was under a Democratic trifecta, and the bills are almost indistinguishable. This is not the same thing. I don't know what will happen. I don't know in this Congress if they could put things together. I don't think they could. Since we never made a deadline in the past, I do think it will go on to the next Congress. But the notion that Republicans and Democrats, particularly statewide elected Democrats, are different from one another is not borne out by the facts. We have a lot of work to do. There's a bipartisan coalition that is very strong to keep things exactly the same. And there's a bipartisan coalition that is quite small that would like to see things changed. And our goal is to widen that coalition. So Ashley asks if I've heard about this impact on DBEs. Nope. If your question is whether or not your program or your project will be affected, that is a call that needs to go to USDOT, to your Federal Highways Office, and to your representatives. Everything is very much in flux, and it's very hard to know what will be affected in the long run. But I would fully expect this administration to not put a lot of energy into enforcing the DBE provisions. Kevin, hello, Kevin, asks how I would propose to create real accountability for state DOTs to deploy formula funds, and how can we get Congress to demand that federal goals be met? I would, I mean, we had gotten in the House bill before President Biden was elected language that said you simply cannot build, you cannot use federal dollars to build something new, whether a highway expansion or a new highway, until you have a clear plan to maintain it, operate and maintain it throughout its useful life while making progress on the rest of your infrastructure. And it was the Biden White House that said that the House bill could not be part of negotiations and wiped improvements like that out. Something simple like that goes a long way in state of repair. But frankly, at this point, I don't know if a federal program, certainly with the members of Congress that have produced the bills of the past, are capable of producing bills that would result in better outcomes. And I would have to see a big change in attitude before I'd want to see the feds involved in this program going forward. I've lost that battle too many times. But there are many ways that we could reward those who make progress on things like safety and restrict those who don't, including, if you're doing poorly on safety, maybe the only thing you can apply for in competitive grants is something that will improve the safety problems you're clearly having. You can't go outside of that. Maybe there is a restriction on how you can spend your formula dollars too, and it has to go overwhelmingly into safety improvements until you can see those changes and you get more flexibility the better you do. There's a lot that we can do, but frankly, I think throttling down the spending is a great way to get some accountability. I have no idea what DOJ's impact on the reauthorization process will be. I'm not really sure what their impact on right now is. A lot of chaos. Who knows if they'll be around in 2 years? I don't. I've never seen anything like this before, so I don't really know how to explain what universe we're in. Sarah asks a great question. Do I know what sort of language we should be using? I mean, clearly going forward and talking about things like racial justice, I think the word justice in general is tough. Apparently we're not for liberty and justice for all anymore. Climate, I don't think transit is a problem yet, though someone asked about the deputy secretary, and the deputy secretary definitely has an issue with transit and Vision Zero, both of which he considers to be, well, transit he calls a local priority. And when these folks call things local priorities, they mean non-highway priorities. So if you're filling one pothole or fixing one intersection on a roadway, federal priority. If you're building interstate passenger rail or a regional rail system, local. That's their code for that. So I think you can talk about safety. I think you can talk about things that are positive for the economy. I think you can really do, what I have done and point to the fact that they are absolutely blowing it on congestion across the country. So generally, I think economic impacts, job creation, business new starts, things that how much the local government or state government is going to have to pay, or the feds are going to be on the hook for longer term costs, is a good thing to get into. We love to build something new like a highway, but we don't want to have to figure out how to pay to maintain it. And so articulating being a responsible government with a plan to maintain what we build is just good governance, is another good way to tackle some of these issues. And it turns out that getting people access to jobs and essential services, no matter how they travel or no matter their finances, safety, making travel more convenient, doing things that are good for the economy. Those are arguments that work on everybody, and the things that the folks that follow Transportation for America care about, they're good for all of those things. So Allison asks, how do we continue to prioritize CO2 reduction and congestion mitigation in transportation planning? Look, congestion mitigation is going to be very much a priority of this administration. It's just their attitude is going to be, you just got to build more highways, expand, add to. I think we're going to have to define what we mean here. And part of it is the things you might do to lower CO2 also happen to be great for local economies, helps people get to jobs, helps employers find talent. So just, if it happens to improve emissions too, maybe just don't mention it. Maybe sell it on the economy and get the bonus of the CO2. That's one way we can go about it. Oh, we've got so many questions and we are unfortunately running out of time. So I really think I will end on the question is, how do you reach out to your congressman when they won't answer the phones or meet? This is such an important question. You might have noticed that some congressmen had and senators will have town halls, but I think that's going to be less and less common. However, they go back to their districts almost every weekend, and they often go to big events. And so if you can follow and figure out where they're going to be, sometimes they make their schedules public, sometimes they announce they'll be at an event. You should go to that event. You should meet them. You should talk to them. You should try to make appointments or go into their district offices. Meetings in district offices matter more than meetings in DC. As a Hill staffer, I would take nonstop meetings in the DC office. And from a member of Congress's point of view, they're doing nothing but taking these meetings in DC, and they all run together. The meetings in the district stand out. And that feels more true to their job because that's their constituents talking to them, not some national group that is coming to talk to them or organized a fly-in. So, go to meetings that your boss, they kind of are our bosses, but your member of Congress is going to participate in the district, go to their offices, even if you're just meeting with their district staff director or caseworkers, and make yourself heard in person there to the extent you possibly can. And then when you find out, where they are on these issues and what they're doing, let us know. I can tell you that quietly, a lot of members of Congress are extremely stressed out. People are nervous, and this uncertainty that you're feeling, everybody's feeling. And so just continue to share any of your projects that are impacted with your congressional delegation so that they're aware. If they did an event with you on that project or they issued a press release, be in touch, because they might have to update that press release or event and point out that that thing they just announced is being retracted. It's not something that people love to do, but letting them know that they might have to be part of something like that might get them to engage a little bit more. I also want to point out that a lot of the state DOTs feel a little more insulated. It is really important to talk with your state legislators, your governors, your DOTs, and point out that if the federal funding for local and regional priorities go away, then you're turning to them and the full responsibility falls on them. Your state DOT might not believe it, but your state legislator will. And then that's important, because that pressure gets back to your state DOT. So many great questions here. So we could spend hours predicting what's going to happen. Nothing like this has ever happened before, so I don't know what's going to happen, but we are going to keep you in the loop. We are going to follow our blog, follow our newsletter to hear the latest about what we're hearing and what we understand to be the current circumstance. And if you hear anything specific in your own neck of the woods, what your federal highways office is saying, what your DOT is saying, what your MPO is learning, or your mayor's office, or any of the transit agencies or local advocates, please send that information our way. We're going to be trying to collect it so that we have a good picture of what's going on across the country, and then we will be sharing that information amongst all of you. Thanks for everything everybody does, and we will be in touch. We will make sure that the recording and slides are shared with folks that attended. So again, thanks so much, everybody. We really appreciate your interest, your dedication to this issue, and we'll be working together going forward.